The wind was older than their prayers. It howled across the dunes like a choir made of ghosts, carrying no sound but sand. The sun had risen red, a furnace without mercy. 12 monks walked beneath it in silence, robes torn by the wind, lips cracked, eyes hollow from days without water. Behind them lay the bones of the last oasis. Ahead, nothing. Brother Mathieu of Tours led them. Once a soldier, now a penitent. His hands still bore the marks of the sword he had long abandoned. He carried a wooden rosary, its beads darkened by sweat and salt. With every step, he whispered a name of God, not to be heard, but to remind himself he still existed. Ave Maria. Gratia plena. The words fell from his mouth like dust. The desert did not answer. They had been walking for weeks, following a path traced only on faith. A pilgrimage from Egypt to the Holy City, through the wilderness where prophets once spoke with fire. But heaven had gone quiet since Edessa fell, since the kings called again for war. The monks had no armies, no banners. They came not to fight, but to redeem. Yet even redemption needs water. The youngest of them stumbled. Mathieu turned, caught him by the arm. "Courage, brother," he said. "Jerusalem is near." The boy looked up, his eyes wide and dry. "I think I saw it," he whispered, "in the light." Then he fell. The wind covered him before the others could kneel. They stopped, exhausted, staring at the mound that grew where he had fallen. Sand became shroud. One of the monks began to sing a psalm, but the sound broke apart in the wind. The horizon shimmered like a mirror, showing nothing but more silence. Mathieu closed his eyes. "We have been judged," he murmured. The others moved on, one by one, until only he remained. He knelt beside the mound, pressing the rosary to his lips. "Forgive us for reaching too far," he said. Then he rose, turned his back to the grave, and walked. By sunset, there were only 3 of them. By midnight, 2. When dawn came, Mathieu was alone. He could no longer tell if the shapes in the distance were dunes or bodies. The heat had stripped him of thought, leaving only rhythm. Foot, breath, prayer, silence. He stopped when his legs refused to move. The horizon wavered, then steadied as if holding its breath. He fell to his knees. The rosary slipped from his hand and landed in the sand. The beads rolled, half sinking. He gathered them again, fingers trembling, and dug into the earth with both hands. The sand was cool a few inches below, soft, almost kind. He lowered the rosary into the hollow and whispered, "If I don't reach the holy city, let it reach me." He pressed the last handful of sand over the beads. The wind rose, filling the air with the sound of distant bells that were not there. The desert moved as if listening. He lay back, eyes open to the sky. The sun burned white, but he smiled. "Take it where I cannot," he whispered. His lips barely moved. The words dissolved into air. The wind lifted the sand, spiraling over his body, over the small mound that hid the rosary. The dunes shifted. The footprints disappeared. The desert kept their secret. And as the screen faded, the last line of his prayer echoed like a vow still traveling. "If I don't reach the holy city, let it reach me." In the year 1148, the Second Crusade marched not with one heart, but with 1,000 uncertain ones. The first had ended in triumph and guilt, leaving behind both a conquered Jerusalem and a shaken faith. The second rose from that shame, a promise to defend what holiness still remained. Kings took the cross again. Armies gathered under banners painted with blood and psalms. But among them walked another kind of army, barefoot, silent, nameless, the monks. They carried no swords. Their armor was cloth. Their shields were prayers. They believed that if knights could win Jerusalem by force, perhaps they could win it again by penance. They called themselves the Brothers of the Desert Road, 12 men chosen from monasteries across Europe, sworn to reach the holy city without spilling blood or demanding bread. They would live on what the Lord provided. In the end, the Lord provided only sand. They began their journey from Cairo, following an ancient pilgrim path through Sinai, where Moses had once seen fire that did not consume. They sang psalms as they walked, the sound thin against the wind. Bedouin tribes watched them from afar, shaking their heads at men who sought God without water. The monks believed their suffering would cleanse the sins of soldiers. They whispered of the old Crusaders who had taken Jerusalem by sword, vowing to reach it by silence. But the desert has no patience for vows. The journey stretched into weeks. Supplies ran thin. The wind erased the old routes carved by caravans. The stars, once their compass, blurred under dust storms. When they prayed for a sign, the sky offered only emptiness. When they prayed for rain, the clouds dissolved. Brother Mathieu of Tours wrote in his small leather journal, the last record of their faith, "The desert is a mirror. It shows not God, but the heart, and our hearts are full of noise." By the 10th day they had lost half their number, some to heat, some to thirst, some to the quiet terror of the endless horizon. The survivors kept walking, each step an act of will, each bead of the rosary a heartbeat. They passed through wadis where old bones lay half-buried. Once they found the remains of a caravan, camels bleached white. The sand fused around them like glass. Mathieu touched one of the skulls and whispered, "Even the beasts die praying here." That night, as the wind screamed through the dunes, the monks gathered around a small fire of dry thorns. The flame flickered blue. One monk, his lips cracked to blood, asked, "Do you think God remembers this road?" No one answered. The silence was their only reply. They began to see Jerusalem in their dreams, not a city of stone and gold, but of light, always just beyond reach. In waking hours, they saw mirages of towers and bells, reflections of their hunger for redemption. One by one, the weaker fell behind, too ashamed to cry out. Mathieu led them forward, reciting the Psalms of pilgrimage. They go from strength to strength. Every one of them appeareth before God in Zion. But each time he said the words, the wind tore them away. The psalm ended in dust. By the 20th day, the group was down to 5. They no longer prayed for arrival. They prayed for endurance. "We were promised the holy city," one said. "Perhaps it was never built for our kind." Mathieu walked ahead, his eyes fixed on the horizon that kept lying. He began to understand what all deserts teach, that the distance between man and God is not measured in miles, but in thirst. At night, the stars looked close enough to touch. The monks lay beneath them and whispered their confessions to the sky, certain that somewhere in the dark beyond the dunes, the holy city listened. The sun had become their judge. Each morning it rose like a blade, cutting through their shadows until even doubt cast none. The sand stretched endless, shimmering with deceit. The monks no longer spoke of distance. They measured the world now in prayers, in beads, in breaths. Every grain of sand seemed to whisper a psalm unfinished. Brother Mathieu led them still, though he no longer felt like a leader. His robe hung loose from his shoulders. His sandals had split. His lips were gray. The others followed by instinct, not by sight. They had stopped asking where he was leading them. They only trusted that moving forward was holier than turning back. He had once been Robert Mathieu of Tours, Knight of Anjou, the man who had fought at Ascalon when he was young and proud. He had killed in God's name and worn the cross on his armor. But killing left its taste. When he returned home, the sound of steel haunted him through every prayer. One night he woke from a dream of burning cities and saw the light of dawn falling on his sword. He left it on the altar, kissed it goodbye, and joined the monastery. He took the name Brother Mathieu. The world called him saintly. He called himself unfinished. Now, years later, that same light, merciless, pale, divine, was his only companion. The monks had once sung together at sunrise. Now their voices cracked before the second verse. They whispered fragments of the Rosary as they walked. One murmured, "Blessed art thou among women," and another finished, "And blessed is the fruit of thy womb." Their words trembled, scattered by the wind. By midday, they could no longer tell where they were. The compass lay broken. The footprints behind them had vanished. The sand gave no direction but obedience. Mathieu carried the rosary wrapped around his hand. Each bead rubbed smooth from years of prayer. He would roll them slowly between his fingers, feeling their warmth, feeling that someone, somewhere, might still be listening. They passed a ridge where the wind had carved shapes that looked like crosses. For a moment, hope rose in them like water. But when they reached the hill, they saw it was only rock. The youngest monk laughed, the sound brittle and strange. "Perhaps the desert mocks us," he said. "No," Mathieu answered. "It reminds us." Of what? That faith is not proof, but persistence. That night they camped without fire. The last oil had been used to anoint the dying. The air was cold, yet it smelled faintly of burnt air, as if heaven had been too near. Mathieu lay awake, counting the beads by touch. Each one a sin remembered, a name forgiven, a prayer unanswered. He no longer asked for deliverance. He asked for endurance. Before dawn, one of the older brothers began to cry. "We left the world to find God," he said, "and God left the world to test us." Mathieu reached for him, pressed his hand to the man's chest. "Then this," he said softly, "is where we meet him." At sunrise, the monk who had wept did not rise again. Mathieu closed his eyes and whispered the creed over him. The others buried him shallowly, marking the grave with a single wooden bead. They moved on in silence. The wind swallowed the trail behind them. Each man carried less of himself than the day before. By noon, only 3 remained. They no longer spoke. They walked as if their steps themselves were prayers. The heat had stripped the flesh from their faith. What was left was bone and will. Mathieu felt his heartbeat slowing, but the rosary still pulsed against his palm, alive in the rhythm of the desert. He thought, perhaps faith survives longer than those who carry it. When night came again, he lifted his hand to the sky, the rosary glowing faintly in starlight. "If we fall," he whispered, "let our prayers keep walking." The wind answered with silence. The sand kept no loyalty. It buried friend and foe in the same silence. By the time the wind changed, the monks had already vanished beneath it, and the desert went on pretending it had never seen them. But the desert remembers differently. 2 days later, a small Bedouin caravan crossed that same valley, moving east with the wind. Their camels trudged slowly, their faces wrapped against the glare. They were men who had learned to read the desert like scripture. Every shadow a sentence, every dune a word. One of them, Ibrahim al-Salim, rode ahead. He was not young nor old, only marked by the patient calm of one who had buried too many travelers. He had no anger left toward pilgrims. To him, they were all the same, men chasing promises that the sand always kept. He saw something on the ridge, a dark shape half covered. He dismounted, walked forward, and brushed the dust away. A human hand, pale, still clasped around a wooden cross. He sighed, whispered, "Peace be upon him," and began to cover the body with sand again. As he worked, his fingers struck something small and round. He cleared more sand and found a string of beads, a rosary, wooden, worn, some beads missing but still whole enough to carry meaning. He turned it in his hand, the desert sun making it glow faintly. It looked like it had been buried, not lost. He looked around. No footprints, No sign of life, only wind. He thought of his own prayer beads, his misbah tucked under his robe. They were not so different. He murmured quietly from memory, "To God belongs the east and the west. Wherever you turn, there is his face." He buried the monk again, gently this time, placing the rosary back on his chest. Then he pressed his hand to the sand and said, "The desert is wide, my brother. May your prayer find the city you could not." His companions called from the ridge, urging him to move on. Ibrahim rose, dusted the sand from his robe, and looked once more at the mound. He thought of his father's words. "Every man dies praying to be heard. The wise do not ask by which name." That night, the caravan camped near the dried bed of a wadi. The stars burned cold above them, sharp enough to wound. The men sat in a circle drinking bitter tea. Ibrahim told them what he had found. One younger man spat. "Infidels," he said. "Let them feed the sand." Ibrahim shook his head. "No. His God and mine share the same wind." The younger man frowned. "And what did you say over him?" "I said what one should always say," Ibrahim replied. "I asked mercy to travel faster than we do." The others fell silent. The fire crackled. The stars seemed closer, pressing down on them like an unspoken truth. Before dawn, Ibrahim awoke to the sound of wind. It was strong, rising from the east, sweeping across the dunes. He stepped outside the camp and saw a strange sight, a line of disturbed sand stretching westward, as if the desert itself were moving something beneath its skin. He followed the line with his eyes until it disappeared into the horizon. It led toward Jerusalem. He stood there for a long time, listening. The wind hummed through the dunes like prayer beads sliding between unseen fingers. He whispered, "Perhaps the earth carries faith where men cannot." When the sun rose, he turned his camel and led the caravan onward. Behind them, the valley closed again. No sign of bodies, no rosary, no graves, only wind. But those who walk the desert long enough know. Some prayers leave footprints the sand refuses to erase. The sun rose without promise. The desert was not cruel that morning. It was indifferent. It gave them light, but no direction, wind, but no mercy. For those who still walked, hope had lost its shape. Faith had become a rhythm of footsteps, not a revelation. Brother Mathieu no longer prayed for deliverance. He prayed for meaning. His throat was dry, his rosary gone, his brothers buried behind him. He carried nothing now but air, and yet the weight of what he carried was heavier than any cross. He remembered the sermons of Bernard of Clairvaux, the call to arms disguised as a call to faith. He had believed that walking to Jerusalem barefoot would atone for all that had been done in its name. But the sand had stripped that certainty from him, as surely as it stripped flesh from his feet. He lifted his eyes to the horizon. It shimmered, blurred, repeated itself. Every direction looked the same. He laughed once, a cracked sound, half cough, half prayer. "Are you watching?" he whispered. The wind answered with dust. He walked until his knees buckled, then crawled. His hands bled. He licked the moisture from his own skin, tasting salt, sin, survival. Around him the air rippled with heat, and in it he thought he saw figures. His brothers walking ahead, rosaries in hand, eyes clear, lips moving. He tried to follow, but the shapes dissolved into mirage. He stopped and listened. For the first time he realized there was no sound. Not of wind, not of breath. Even the desert had stopped breathing. He knelt, head bowed, and whispered, "Have you gone?" A voice in his memory answered, the echo of an old abbot. "Heaven is never empty, only silent. The silence is your test." Mathieu closed his eyes. "Then test me," he said. The silence deepened. He began to recite the creed, slowly, each word dragging across his tongue like a stone. Credo in unum Deum. The Latin trembled in the air, fragile as smoke. Halfway through, his strength failed. He fell forward, his face in the sand. He waited for death, or for a sign, whichever came first. Instead, a small thing happened. The wind shifted. It carried the faint sound of something rolling. A dry click, rhythmic, gentle, like beads. He opened his eyes. There was nothing around him, only the endless pale sea of sand. But he heard it again. Click, click, click. The sound of a rosary being prayed by hands not his own. He looked toward the west, where the dunes rose higher. The sound faded, returned, faded again. He crawled toward it, pulling himself inch by inch, his lips murmuring words he no longer understood. When he reached the ridge, the wind stopped. He found nothing, only smooth sand and his own shadow. He pressed his ear to the ground. The sound was gone, but he felt warmth beneath the surface, faint, pulsing, alive. He whispered, "You still remember." He sat there for hours, staring at the sky. The clouds were thin and high, drifting like veils. He realized that heaven's silence was not absence, it was endurance. That perhaps God does not shout across deserts, but waits quietly beneath them. He wept, though his eyes were dry. He looked at his empty hands, the palms cracked and bleeding. For a moment he imagined the rosary there again. The wood, the cord, the memory of every bead he had touched. He lifted his hands to the air and moved them as if the beads were still there. One by one, he began to pray. Each invisible bead, each breath, each word rose and vanished into the sky. And for the first time in days, he felt peace, not comfort, not safety, but peace that does not depend on survival. The sun fell, the horizon burned, the desert kept its silence, and heaven did not speak, but it listened. Night descended without stars. The air was thick with heat left over from the day, a warmth that refused to die. The dunes glowed faintly, as if they remembered the sun. Brother Mathieu lay upon the sand, his breath shallow, his hands trembling against his chest. The world had narrowed to sound, the slow hiss of wind and the beating of his heart, irregular but stubborn. He knew he would not reach Jerusalem. The road had vanished, the sky offered no map, and the body that had once carried armor now refused even to kneel. But surrender was not defeat, it was confession. And in confession, he had always found a kind of light. He gathered what strength he had left and dug into the sand with his hands. The ground was soft, almost gentle. He dug until his nails filled with dust, until a hollow formed between his knees. The movement steadied his breath. He looked at his palms, raw, bleeding, empty, and whispered, "You took my brothers, my voice, my body, but not this." He reached for his neck. Around it hung the thin cord that had once held his rosary. The beads were gone, scattered, buried, taken by the wind. Only one bead remained, clinging to the thread near his collar. He held it between his fingers. It was smooth from years of touch, darkened by the oil of his skin. He smiled. "You are the last of my prayers." He lowered the bead into the hollow and covered it with sand, grain by grain. With every handful, he spoke a word, half prayer, half farewell. For the living, sand fell. For the lost, sand again. For the city I will not see. His voice faltered. If I do not reach it, let it reach me. The wind began to rise, moving in slow spirals around him. It carried the sound of distant whispers, too faint to be words, too human to be imagination. It might have been his brother's voices, or angels, or only the sigh of the earth. He could not tell. He did not need to. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to the mound. The sand was cool. It felt like a blessing. He stayed that way, praying without sound, his lips moving in rhythm with the wind. He thought of the city, of bells and olive trees, of stone walls kissed by morning light. He saw it clearly now, though he had never stood within it. He saw the streets shining like water, the doors open, the silence welcoming. "You are nearer than I thought," he said. The wind grew stronger, circling him, lifting grains into the air until they shimmered like dust made of stars. It covered his footprints, his hands, his robe. The mound that held the rosary vanished beneath the storm, but the shape of it remained in the air, like a memory refusing to fade. He felt his body sinking, not into death but into stillness. He smiled once more. "Carry it," he whispered. "Carry what I could not." His eyes closed. The wind howled louder, then fell silent all at once. The desert exhaled. By dawn there was nothing left of him but a faint rise in the sand and a small circle of darker earth where the prayer had gone in. And when the first light touched the horizon, a current of wind swept east, long, steady, deliberate, toward the holy city. The desert had taken the pilgrim, but not his faith. At sunrise, the wind softened. The dunes stretched in every direction like an ocean frozen mid-wave. The world was empty again, but not silent. Beneath the surface, the sand carried a pulse, slow, steady, alive. The desert had taken Brother Mathieu, yet it could not bury what he left behind. By noon, a caravan approached from the south. They were Bedouins, Ibrahim among them, returning from trade along the coast. The men moved in single file, the camels groaning, the air trembling with heat. Ibrahim lifted his hand and stopped. "There," he said, pointing toward a small rise in the sand. It looked different, smoother, darker, untouched by wind. He dismounted and walked forward. He knelt beside the mound, pressing his palm to the earth. It was cool. "Here," he murmured. "He rests." The others watched from a distance. They had learned not to question him when he spoke like that. Ibrahim closed his eyes and began to dig. The sand moved easily as if willing to be opened. He uncovered the edge of a simple cord. No beads, no metal, nothing to mark it as precious. Yet the air around it felt charged, alive. He did not take it. He covered it again, whispering a verse. "And we made from water every living thing." Then gently, he pressed the sand down with both hands. When he stood, his palms were warm. He looked east. The wind moved lightly, brushing the dunes into lines that stretched toward Jerusalem. He smiled faintly. "He is walking still," he said. That night they camped near a cluster of rocks. The men gathered wood and built a small fire. Over it they boiled tea and told stories, of prophets, of storms, of travelers who had crossed the desert and never returned. Ibrahim said little. He sat apart, staring at the horizon. When asked what he was thinking, he said, "Of a man who prayed until the earth listened." The others laughed softly, uneasy. One said, "You've spent too long among the dunes, old friend. You start hearing them speak." Ibrahim nodded. Maybe that is what prayer truly is, hearing what the world says when we stop talking. Later, as the fire died, he saw something strange. The wind picked up again, swirling across the camp. It brushed the surface of the sand until a small shimmer appeared. Faint, like moonlight reflected on glass. He walked toward it and knelt. Beneath the thin layer of dust, he saw them. A few wooden beads, half buried, glinting in the starlight. He reached out, then stopped. The air was warm, fragrant, carrying a scent he could not name. Not incense, not smoke. Something older. He whispered, "Your prayer has not finished." He covered the beads again, not to hide them, but to protect them. "Rest here until you're ready to move." When he returned to the camp, he lay awake, watching the stars drift. He thought of his own faith, of the words he had repeated since childhood, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the merciful, the compassionate. He realized he had been saying them for others, never for himself. That night he said them for the monk. Days later they reached the edge of the desert. The wind rose behind them, pushing them east. The men shielded their faces, but Ibrahim smiled into it. He knew where it was going. Back where the monk had fallen, the sand shifted once more. The small mound flattened, then opened, just slightly. The cord that held the rosary rose to the surface. One bead rolled free, catching the sunlight. It gleamed briefly before the wind lifted it and carried it away. It drifted for miles, weightless, graceful, one prayer bead crossing the desert. It did not fall again until the hills of Judea appeared. And when it landed on a road that led to Jerusalem. Decades passed. The war that sent the monks into the desert had ended, then begun again, then ended once more. New kings had worn crowns, new banners had burned. The pilgrims who came after remembered neither names nor vows. They followed the path by instinct, drawn by the echo of something older than maps. And one day they found what the wind had carried. A troop of crusaders crossed the Sinai under a high, merciless sky. Among them rode a chaplain named Brother Anselm, a quiet man who prayed more than he preached. Their mission was simple: to reach Jerusalem and hold it against the next war that everyone already knew would come. But in the desert, plans meant little. By the fourth day, the heat had split their lips in their faith. The horses stumbled. The men cursed the silence. Then a young soldier cried out. He had found something glinting in the sand. Anselm dismounted and brushed the dust away. There, half buried, lay a string of wooden beads, dried, dark, yet untouched by rot. The cord was unbroken. 12 beads remained. The men gathered around, whispering. "It's a monk's rosary," one said, "from the old pilgrim trails." "Then it is a relic," another answered. "Perhaps left for us to find." Anselm held it up. The beads were warm in his hand, though the air was cold. He could smell faintly of olive wood, of salt, of something sacred that did not belong to time. He whispered, "Someone prayed these once, and the prayer is not done." That night they camped beside a dry wadi. Anselm hung the rosary on a post near the fire. The wind rose again, soft, circling the camp. The beads began to sway, tapping gently against each other, rhythm without human touch. The sound was small, but it filled the men with unease, like hearing a heart still beating long after the body was gone. In the morning, Anselm found the sand beneath the rosary damp, as if dew had fallen only there. He took it as a sign. They left the desert with new strength, carrying the beads as their standard. When they reached Jerusalem weeks later, Anselm went straight to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He laid the rosary upon the altar and said, "This has already walked farther than we ever will." The priest who received it nodded, touched the beads, and drew his hand back quickly. "They're warm," he murmured. "Still alive." The rosary remained there for years. Pilgrims came to see it. They called it the rosary that walked alone. Some said it cured fever. Others swore it moved slightly at night, as if the prayer inside it still sought completion. Anselm died in the city he had only hoped to visit. In his final confession he said, "It was not we who reached Jerusalem. It was him, the one whose prayer never stopped walking." Centuries later, the beads would darken. Their cord would fray. But the story stayed. Chroniclers wrote of a monk who buried his rosary in the sands, and of a wind that carried it east. The church guarded the relic in a small glass reliquary, no longer certain whether it was miracle or myth. Today, deep inside the sepulchre's quiet chapel, pilgrims still kneel before that glass. They see nothing move, hear nothing. Yet some say they feel a pulse beneath the silence, as if the beads remember every hand that ever touched them. No inscription marks the case. Only a single line carved in Latin. Fides ambulavit longius quam homines. Faith traveled farther than men. Jerusalem had seen too many wars to remember peace. Yet inside the Holy Sepulchre, the air was still. Candles flickered, smoke curling upward like tired prayers. The rosary lay behind glass, dull with age, its wooden beads nearly black, its cord faded to threads. Pilgrims came and went, crossing themselves, whispering names of loved ones, leaving coins or tears. No one knew whose hands had once held it. No one knew the desert that had carried it here. But the silence around it was holy. Some said the beads moved when no one watched. Others claimed the glass warmed under the touch of those who prayed honestly. The priests gave no answer. They only smiled, as if even doubt were part of the devotion. A Cistercian monk from France came one day, barefoot and weary, tracing the path of the lost pilgrims from long ago. He had heard of the rosary that walked itself. When he saw it, he fell to his knees. He did not ask for miracles. He only whispered, "We failed to reach you, but you reached us." His words broke in his throat. He stayed there for hours, watching the candlelight shift across the glass. The beads did not move, yet the air trembled faintly like breath too gentle to see. He thought of Brother Mathieu, though he did not know his name, and felt the weight of every journey that never ended. He wrote in his travel journal, "Perhaps the saints are not those who arrived, but those who walked until they disappeared." Outside, Jerusalem's bells began to ring. The sound rolled through the narrow streets, mixing with the muezzin's call. 2 prayers, 2 melodies, 1 sky. The people barely noticed how the tones wove together, how the echo became something larger than either faith alone. Inside the chapel, the monk rose. He pressed his hand to the glass. "You walked alone," he whispered. "Now walk for us all." Then he turned and left, his footsteps echoing like beads falling one by one. Centuries later, the church changed hands again. The armies came and went, burning, rebuilding, forgetting. But through every conquest, the rosary survived. It was small enough to be overlooked, too quiet to be destroyed. Some relics shout. This one listened. The scholars who studied it spoke of coincidence, of wind and superstition. The faithful spoke of grace. But the truth lay somewhere in between, in the space where faith outlives its believers. The desert that once swallowed the monks still shifts, still whispers. Some travelers say that when the wind rises at dusk, it hums like wood striking wood, a rhythm of prayer older than language. They say that sound heads east, always east. And in Jerusalem, in the cool of the chapel, the rosary rests unchanged. The pilgrims still come, not for miracles, but to be reminded that holiness is not distance, but direction. That sometimes belief keeps walking when the believer cannot. That faith is stronger than those who carry it, and kinder. The city waits, the sand waits, the beads wait, and somewhere between them a prayer still travels. The wind over Sinai has not changed. It still carries dust, still hums with forgotten names. Every grain that moves beneath the sun has touched the bones of someone who believed. Somewhere under those dunes lies a hollow where a man knelt, and beneath that hollow a rosary once buried itself into the earth like a seed. When the wind rises, it moves east, always east, toward the hills of Judea, toward the city that broke and mended 1,000 times. It crosses borders no empire can claim. It touches minarets and crosses alike. It enters Jerusalem the way prayers do, unseen, unstoppable. Inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the old Rosary remains. The glass that holds it has fogged from centuries of breath. Pilgrims still lean close, whispering thanks, regrets, questions. The beads do not answer. They have already spoken. They say nothing now because they are still traveling, not through distance but through hearts that remember why they began. Brother Mathieu never reached the Holy City, yet the Holy City reached him. His prayer arrived long after he was gone, carried by the same wind that still moves tonight. When you stand on the threshold of that church and listen, you can hear the murmur of two worlds, the wind outside and the silence within. Together they sound like faith breathing. Faith does not need proof. It needs persistence. It does not stop at walls or graves or wars. It keeps walking. If prayer could cross the desert, mercy can cross us. If faith could outlive the flesh, compassion can outlive the fire. If one man's whisper could reach the city he never saw, then no distance is too far for grace. The wind will move again tomorrow. It always does. It will pass over ruins and roofs, through mosques and monasteries, through hands folded and hands empty. It will carry the same words that have never stopped traveling. Forgive, endure, walk on. Sometimes faith travels farther than its believers. Sometimes the sand remembers what heaven forgets. And sometimes when the world burns, a single prayer still walks through the fire. If prayer can cross the desert, so can we.